So in the Old Testament reading today, the author of First Book of Kings paints a very agreeable picture of a faithful king. In the excerpt from chapter 2 that started it out, we're told that David slept with his ancestors. Now, slept with his ancestors, that's Old Testament code for David took a dirt nap. And he died after 40 years of reigning over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. And he died, and Solomon ascended to the throne, and then we're told his kingdom was firmly established. And then we skip down to the excerpted passages from chapter 3, and we find out that Solomon was just this super great guy. He loved the Lord, he followed the rules, he sacrificed regularly to God. And if you know what you're listening to, you hear there a little hint of things being not quite right. Because we're told that he went to sacrifice at the high places. In the Old Testament, again, in code, a high place was a place or a religious site where people went to sacrifice. And it was not necessarily a place where you went to sacrifice to God, but it was where you would sacrifice to whatever God it was that you worshiped. And many of the high places that existed in that area at that time, many of the high places that Solomon went to, were actually religious sites for deities other than the God that Solomon and the people of Israel worshiped. When you look at the totality of circumstances, it appears at least that Solomon may have been hedging his bets a little bit by worshiping other gods. But regardless of playing fast and loose with where to worship, he was apparently this great guy. He was so great that God appeared to him and asked him what he wanted. Think about that. God came to him in a vision and he said, "You know, Solomon, you are such a great guy that I can't help but notice. And I was wondering, what gift would you like from me?" The mind reels, doesn't it? Imagine in your life if God suddenly appeared to you in a vision and said, "You know what? You are doing such a bang-up job at life that I just have to ask, what would you like? You've earned it. You've earned anything you want. Just name it. What would you ask for? Money? Power? Immortality? Fame? What would you ask for? Solomon, we're told, thinks about that question for a minute, and then he asks for greater understanding. He says, "You know what, God? What I want is the ability to discern between good and evil while I am governing your people." How many of you have ever done a job interview as somebody that was interviewing someone else? Okay. You know how when you're interviewing that person and you ask them, "What's your greatest fault?" And sometimes they come back with something like, "Oh, you know, I think my greatest fault or my greatest weakness is that I just care too much about doing my job." Solomon is that guy. But Solomon gets what he wanted anyway. He gets wisdom and discernment. Not only that, but because that's what he asked for, God then goes ahead and gives him money and power and honor. And if you're to believe the passages that we read, at least, Solomon goes on to live happily ever after. Which is really cool. But what I want to share with you today is that that's not really the whole story. There is more to it. And the whole story is actually a little bit more sordid than that, because it is Old Testament. So let's go back to the very beginning of that passage that we read, where it says David dies and Solomon takes the throne and his kingdom is firmly established. It seems simple enough, right? Well, it's not quite that simple. Because in 1 Kings chapter 2, and the passages before the place where the reading started, David is old. David is dying. His time was drawing near, so he summons his son Solomon. And he says, according to scriptures, I am about to die, so be strong and act like a man. Observe what the Lord requires and walk in obedience to his commands. It's okay so far. A little intense, but okay. And then David goes on, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit to kind of put it in more understandable language. David goes on to say to Solomon, now Solomon, you remember what that guy Joab did to me when he killed my generals. And you remember that there's that guy named Shimei. You know, the one that called curses down on me that one day. Now, Solomon, I'm not telling you what to do. You go ahead and do whatever you think is right, but just make sure that you kill both of them. And it's with that advice from his father ringing in his ears that Solomon meets his first challenge in his new administration when he does come to power. Because one of his own brothers, named of Adonijah, makes a play for power. His own brother goes to Solomon's mom and asks her to help him kind of get into a place where he could take advantage. And when mom reports to Solomon what Adonijah has done, Solomon has him killed. And then he has Joab killed. Joab he has killed at one of those high places, and he's actually holding on to the altar when the person kills him. Then he has Shimei killed. And there's one other guy, he was a priest named Abiathar. Solomon has him stripped of his title and exiled. He doesn't have him killed because he carried the Ark of the Covenant once, so that's worth something. But you get the idea of what Solomon was like. He may have been very wise, but in some ways he also acted like a quintessential mob wise guy. He killed people that posed a threat. He killed people that had angered his father. Possibly he killed people who just might have been a threat at some point. So as smart as Solomon was and as wise as he was, he did have a few issues to go along with that wisdom that he had. Now, Solomon had the rep as being wise. The kind of guy that could solve anything. So once he had that reputation established, people would bring him perplexing problems and ask him to help. And it's later in chapter 3, just a little bit past the readings that we've had, that we learn about a particularly famous case. And if you know one thing about Solomon, it's probably this. It's the one that I learned in Sunday school. It's the one Mrs. Kieselhorst taught me about. Because it seems there was this thing happening where two women were claiming the same baby. Can't have that, of course. Only one of them could be the real mother, and the other one, her baby had died. So she wanted to replace him. But nobody knew who the real mom was. They didn't want to wait for DNA testing to come back. So they went to Solomon. He presented the baby. I have a stand-in. It's Cameron's bear. We also thought maybe it was Rachel's. I'm not sure. The women brought the child, and they said, "This is our baby." Both of them said that. "This is our baby, so, how do we resolve this?" It's a perplexing problem. Solomon, fortunately, knows how to get right to the heart of the matter, because his solution is, you know what, we'll take this, and we'll cut the baby in half, right? That way both moms get half the baby. What could be a better solution than that? Well, it ended well. The one mom, the real mom, was horrified. And she said, "You know what? Never mind. You don't have to do that." So, of course, Solomon knew who the real mom was. He awarded the baby to her. And the other woman went away. I don't know what happened to her. So it all ended well. But after what I've read this week, I am convinced that part of the reason that strategy worked, and I'm hoping it was a strategy, part of the reason that worked is that the women didn't just assume he was using, some kind of hyperbolic irony to make a point. I think the women knew that Solomon might just be crazy enough to do that. So the mom was willing to give up her claim. Now, we have that. And since we're talking about interesting character facets, there is one other thing to bring up. It might be worth bringing up that Solomon had 700 wives. Now, I once said in another place and in another sermon that we think of Solomon as being super intelligent, but if he really was, then why did he have 700 wives? And my wife pointed out that was an unwise thing to say.
But you said it again.
But I said it again. Because I think it's relevant. And it's relevant here because if Solomon really was wise, and part of that wisdom was to know God's law and to be able to discern right from wrong, which is what he asked for. Maybe at some point you look at Solomon and you say, dude, maybe you could have stopped at like 500 wives. 700 seems excessive. Now it turns out, of course, that when you look at those marriages, and we have to put marriages in air quotes really, most of them were not for love. They were political and they were diplomatic marriages, which were done to cement treaties and solidify alliances. But even then, we learn that Solomon was willing to set aside conventional morals and conventional concepts of marriage, even from 3,000 years ago, and exploit them purely for his own gain, for the gain of his kingdom. Looking back and commenting on all of this, a writer and scholar by the name of Dr. Gleason Archer wrote, "Clearly the gift of wisdom did not include the gift of faithfulness to moral principle." To which you have to go, duh. Solomon had issues. He was a great and wise leader, of course, but he did also kind of come across like a modern-day mob boss. Because we learned that Solomon was not afraid to kill when it was to his advantage. We learned he was not afraid to exploit women to achieve goals that he thought were worthy. And we also learned, and we didn't talk about this, but we also learned that Solomon himself went to these high places to worship other deities. And yet, for all of that, we know that Solomon was part of God's plan for Israel. For all of these things, even still, Solomon was a piece of the puzzle of God's vision for redemption. It's certainly not for us to say whether his virtues outweighed his moral issues, but we do definitely know he had both. And yet God still used him. What does that mean for us 3,000 years later? I think the simple lesson is it doesn't matter if you're flawed. God still has a plan for you. It doesn't matter if you have issues. God has a vision. He has a vision for his world, and you are a part of it. It doesn't matter how badly you think you've messed up. God is still there offering God's grace and forgiveness and a chance to be part of this great work of redemption that God is doing in his world. Now, I'm not perfect. Shocker, I know. I'm not. I eat too much. I can be stubborn sometimes. Sometimes I have a problem with authority. I have a temper. I get sidetracked sometimes and I do things that I want to do rather than the things that need to get done. You can stop me anytime. Let's just say there's a list. I've seen it. But for all of that, I know that God still has uses for me. God still has a plan. There are things that I can do that God needs done, and God wants me to do those. As flawed and broken as I am, there are still ways that I can have a positive effect in this world if I just follow where God's leading. If I just set aside my own doubts and hesitation and step out in faith. And that same thing is true about you. That same thing is true about everybody in this room, because whether you're young or old or rich or poor, each and every one of us has a place and a purpose in God's plan for this world. So after service today, or even during service, if you want, if you go to our church Facebook page, you'll find a comment, or a post that just says, I serve by. And I'd like you to think about how you are serving now. Because everybody in this sanctuary has served or is serving God in this church. So I'd like you to go to that post that says, I serve by, and post a selfie. And say how you serve, what you've done, what you're doing. Because this church, this body of believers, has a place and a purpose in God's plan as well. And I think that our place and our purpose might be even greater than we found already. So there's another post on our Facebook page that says, I think we can. And as you think about what you've done, and as you think about the talents that you have, and you look around at the people around you and think about the talents that they have, I'd like you to post a comment where it says, I think we can. Post a comment about something that you think we could be doing in the community. Sort of a Facebook brainstorm. Because we're already doing a lot, but there is a lot that could be done. So go. Think about the gifts and the talents that you see around you and the needs that you see in the community. And post a comment that finishes the statement, I think we can. And I would encourage you to let your imagination run wild with this one. Let your hearts be bold. Because that is what God is calling us to.